On the surface, it might seem like the absolute power of Satoru Gojo is a completely good thing. The raw talent and strength that he was born with, it's wholly good. But when taking a deeper look at his character, we can very clearly come to see that there are some negative aspects to it. In some ways, Gojo's strength is portrayed as a negative thing. It's not completely bad, but it's not completely good either. Point being, beyond the surface level, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Today I want to take a deeper look at the character of Gojo, as well as his relationship with strength. It's not just with him either. In Jujutsu Kaisen as a whole, strength has sometimes led to more harm than good in some cases. This video will mostly focus on Gojo though, but also how this curse of strength affects others in the series as well. It isn't something only seen through Gojo, but mostly is seen within him. But we can see it through other characters as well. Gojo is just the best display of it in my eyes, and it's also a huge part of his character as you'll come to see. By the way, there will be major manga spoilers in this video. Alongside Gojo's great strength and talent comes some level of suffering. Within Gojo, strength creates a sort of identity crisis. Keep that in mind as we chronicle his life in relation to his strength. Let's start from the beginning. The second Gojo is born, the balance of the world shifts, not just metaphorically, but literally too. Ever since his birth, Gojo has been defined by his excessive power, and he defined everything else with his excessive power as well. The reason he's so special is because of that. Right from the beginning of his life, his strength dictated how everything would go in his life, for him and for the world. As covered in my previous essay, I discussed how fate is an incredibly prominent law of nature in JJK's verse, and how it can be viewed as a curse in some aspects. Gojo's strength intertwines with fate, as someone like Gojo was fated to eventually be born, and shift fate in reality entirely. In a sense, his life was already written right from the get-go, solely due to the power he was born with. People even hunt him as a kid and revolve their lives around his existence. It's no threat to him, but still, these glimpses into Gojo's childhood show how his strength had already isolated him. He never knew what a normal life was like because of it. Naturally, we got to see this way more in depth in Hidden Inventory. This is somewhat viewed as a happier time in Gojo's life, but also introduced the biggest shift in his life too, further emphasizing the negative side effects of his great power. Gojo's strength molded him into being the person he was, confident, proactive, intelligent, playful, and maybe even a bit cocky, but also dedicated. We can see him display all these traits in this arc. By all accounts, he's a prodigy, and he seems almost infallible, but still, he knows his strength's importance, going so far as to give up sleeping and sacrificing his health just to be ready for Toji to strike. He might seem like he's overconfident with his power, but really, he isn't. He knows what he has, he uses it wisely. He's incredibly gifted. And in this arc, he faces a huge turn in his life, in multiple aspects. Gojo was always strong before, but with his awakening against Toji, he felt reborn. His strength and skill reached new heights. His power had already dictated his life, but now those effects get dialed up even further. It seems like he's on top of the world. He's made a breakthrough in his mastery of Jujutsu, he's physically grown, and he's quite literally untouchable, even more so than before. But this is where we start to see him slip, and where the darker side of his strength really comes into play. He's obviously faced hardships, as seen with Toji, but as with any sorcerer, they're bound to face that alongside life or death situations. Part of being a sorcerer is the willingness to die if necessary. But this is where Gojo faces a different type of loss, an unexpected one. Hence the section of this arc titled Premature Death. Referring to Geto, obviously he doesn't actually die, but it's more metaphorical death. Gojo helplessly watches his friend turn to darkness. And for once, despite his awesome strength, his strength can't do anything here. He loses his closest friend, and all he could do is just watch. Geto of course went through his own sort of identity crisis as well, trying to figure out where he wanted to go next. He felt like his actions meant nothing. Even their whole mission was meaningless in the end because Tengen ended up stabilizing regardless. He learns of Haibara's death. He watched Riko die. He nearly lost Gojo, and his own life. Despite his own great strength, he couldn't do anything. He lost to someone who couldn't even use Jujutsu. Despite his blessings, he lost. His spirit has been broken, and his partner is now in a new realm of power, going on missions alone, with the two slowly getting more isolated from each other. Gojo's former best friend is the one to spearhead his identity crisis. Is he the strongest because he's Satoru Gojo, or is he Satoru Gojo because he's the strongest? It's a direct attack to his identity, or the lack thereof. Is his strength as a sorcerer really his only defining trait? Is that just his whole identity right there? And on top of that, how much does his strength define his character beyond that? If that isn't his whole identity, then surely enough it does shape that identity, at least to some degree. His power and his identity, they're very tightly intertwined, and they bring on a new sense of loneliness too. This also comes to a head in the Shibuya incident. His own feelings of loneliness and melancholy are directly what leads to Kenjaku's plan working in the first place. I've seen some people call Gojo a heartless and unfeeling person, but I always thought that was a very bad judgment of his character for many reasons that would deserve its own video. So, without going into a tangent about that specific topic, I will at least say that this part of the Shibuya incident definitely proves that he's not that unfeeling person some people think he is. Him getting trapped by the prison realm shows a lot of his character, both regarding his feelings about himself and how he views others. He most certainly isn't the cruel, unfeeling monster some people say he is. When first faced with the prison realm, We see him staring at it, and staring back at him is his face, or rather, the lack thereof. Looking into the prison realm, he sees a blank version of himself, and he looks fearful. He's taken aback, emotionally and physically, staring into the unknown. What did he see in there that made him so fearful? Why Gojo of all people? Why is he scared of that? This scene in particular seems really small, but it's actually really important in my eyes. And what he's so fearful of isn't because of what he saw, it's because of what he didn't see. Obviously, faces represent one's identity. It's one of the best representations of that. And here, Gojo is seeing himself as a faceless entity, an inhuman vessel of strength with no sort of identity at all. Strength has always been such a huge piece of his identity, and also how he projects identity onto others. Look at his fight with Jogo, for example, contrasted with Sukuna's fight with Jogo. Jogo, despite actually being relatively strong, in comparison to Gojo, he was nothing. Gojo had no care about him. He was just a weak curse in his eyes. But as we see later on, Jogo and his crew have feelings and shortcomings. They have human consciousness. Gojo brushing Jogo off for it gets to him, until Sukuna of all people later on acknowledges his strength and calls him strong. But back to Gojo. Strength isn't just a huge part of his identity, but his perception of others' identity. And he's not the only one who thinks like this. But here he's just looking at himself. He sees nothing, a blank face. Here he's seeing the second thing that Geto said. He's not seeing Gojo here, he's just seeing the strongest. And it's no coincidence that he's staring right into the eye of the prison realm too. A prison. He is directly facing down his identity crisis through a mirror made by a prison. This identity crisis he's had his whole life, intertwined with his strength in general, it's been a prison for him in a way. He quite literally walks around in a quote-unquote bubble created by infinity, completely untouchable by anybody, unless he wills it. Not only does it physically keep things out, but metaphorically keeps things out. It isolates him. Plus, he's essentially facing down the ghost of Geto here. And the emotions from seeing him again is what makes him vulnerable enough to be trapped by the prison realm in the first place. That's the whole reason Kenjaku's plan even works. He first stares down an unknown entity, looking at a faceless mirror image of himself through the prison realm, and then faces down a ghost from his past. Kenjaku knows this is a way to get under his skin, and clearly it works. His identity crisis, and by extension his solitude from strength, those are two fatal flaws that Gojo's had his entire life and never really dealt with. Because how could he deal with them? No one else has to deal with the same sort of thing. At least in this section of the series. Gojo's always been so far above everyone else. He's always been in such a unique position. The only other person who experienced anything close to this was Toji. Naoya alludes to this later on in chapter 151, mentioning the fact that no one could understand Toji besides Gojo. That's another reason why that fight was so pivotal for Gojo. But following the Culling game, we see a bunch of strong sorcerers from eras ago. People that experienced the same sort of thing as Gojo. Now there's actually people to compare him to somewhat, even if they may have not been on a similar level. People who have gone through similar identity crises. People with the same sort of feelings as Gojo. Yoruzu, for example, she's completely defined by her strength, and her love for Sukuna. She blatantly spells it out for the audience too. Ultimate strength brings solitude. And in chapter 230, amidst the fight between Gojo and Sukuna, those words echo through his head again. He could see that through Gojo, but also feels it himself, even though he's not affected the same way. This fight is obviously important for a lot of reasons, but when you look deeper into the dialogue and the context of the fight too, it is heavily intertwined with Gojo's identity crisis, more so than pretty much anything else in the manga so far. For the first time in a while, Gojo's actually facing someone that's on his level. He had Geto before, someone who was always sort of an equal to him. He fought Toji, who was an equal in some ways. After that, he had pretty much nothing. But here he's fighting someone like that again. Sukuna, who bears the same exact coveted title, the strongest. People with some ultimate level of strength in this story, they're often held back in some regard by their strength. It brings solitude. Yoruzu experienced it. Toji could only be understood by someone like Gojo. Gojo lost one of the most important things to him and became more solitary, etc. It's the same type of solitude that Sukuna thrives in, and Kashimo for that matter has his own views on it, mainly looking for a way to entertain himself. Because when you're the strongest, it's kind of boring and lonely. And it's not just these characters either. Kenjaku, for example, he just screws around basically as a mad scientist, testing the limits of jutsu and seeing what's possible. That's what he uses his great power for, and that's how he finds fun. Then there are others who suffer from strength as well. Maki is a pretty obvious example. In order to achieve her full strength, she lost Mai. And in her own words, her heart was taken too. Despite the great power she has now, there was a cost alongside it. Or Yuta. Yuta's strength is a literal curse for him, one that Rika had to bear because of his loss of her, to the point where Yuta didn't want to live anymore, out of how lonely this strength made him. So there are others who have coped with strength in different ways. Some, like Maki or Yuta, their strength comes at a great cost. Others who have the great strength from the get-go, like Kashimo for example, he tries to find ways to make it fulfilling. The whole reason he ends up wanting to fight Sukuna. But just like Kashimo, this fight is huge for Gojo. It lets him actually use his strength fully for once. For something necessary too. He gets to prove his title as the strongest. He's finally facing someone again that stands on the same ground as him. He looks almost happy throughout the entire fight, like he's enjoying himself. Of course, he always has that extroverted, playful, and almost cocky demeanor, but here it looks more like genuine happiness from the thrill he's facing. And before this battle, he's surrounded by his students and friends. He does something interesting here. Yuji tries to slap him on the back, blocked by infinity, that literal and metaphorical barrier created from his strength that always made him foreign to others. Barrier, for lack of a better word, I know that's not what it is. But he turns off that barrier here and lets everyone make contact with him to wish him luck. I really wish we got to see more of what happened over this time skip, because you could tell Gojo has a deep respect for everyone around him and really cares for them. His strength always made him so far removed, but now that gap is closing, right before his battle with someone stronger than him no less. The battle with Sukuna is a great equalizer. And despite being the battle that seemingly kills him, it's also the one that finally opens him up. And with the last time we see him, he even has a slight smile on his face. He's happy about it. In that airport scene, he's back in that happy time of his life. The people he's lost, they're all there waiting for him. He's no longer isolated. He's happy. Both through his fight being watched by everybody and the fact that he ends up in that airport surrounded by everyone, he's dying surrounded by others. It's the exact goal Yuji's grandpa gave to him in Chapter 1. A fulfilling death. One where Gojo's actually content. Throughout the fight, Sukuna would even taunt Gojo, getting under his skin with that same identity crisis he faced before, like calling him a nameless fish on the chopping board. But at the end of the fight, he compliments him. A sincere compliment from the King of Curses. He acknowledges Gojo's strength, he admires it, and he assures Gojo he'll be remembered, followed up by that slight smile we see from Gojo. He is being remembered for his strength, but at the same time, Satoru Gojo is being remembered. It's not the strongest being remembered, a faceless vessel. It's him, Satoru Gojo, the strongest. He's the strongest because he is Gojo. He defined his strength, not the other way around. Of course, this isn't to say his strength is wholly negative, nor implying that Gojo completely resents it and wants to get rid of being the strongest. But the fact that strength is often portrayed negatively, it's a pretty interesting aspect of the series for me. Strength doesn't just solve everyone's problems from the get-go. In fact, it leads to more problems in the long run. There's an element of suffering that comes with the strength that many of these characters display. There's an element of solitude that comes with it. And sometimes there's a cost associated with it. The downsides or suffering that everyone experiences, it's different for each character. And naturally there are some who embrace it, like Sukuna. But it's really interesting how Gojo, this guy who's always been built up as the strongest character in the series, he faces this level of suffering from it, this identity crisis. These characters that are gifted great strength, or these characters that earn great strength in some way, naturally they benefit from this great power, but at the same time there's always some sort of cost associated with it. And it's up to each individual character to decide how to deal with that. Will their strength define them and dictate their entire life? Will it destroy their identity? Or is there more to them beyond that? Can they grow in spite of it? Let me know what you guys thought below. I know it's a pretty apparent theme of the series, and I'm not the first one to talk about it, but I still find it very interesting, and I enjoyed picking it apart. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.